Screen looks good. Does the screen look okay?
Yeah, I'm seeing how to elevate your floodplain building.
Awesome. Okay. And then I wanted to thank those of you who participated in our pre-training survey. So after this, I'll be sending out a post-training survey so you can hopefully give us some feedback and then we can improve these courses for you. I also wanted to clarify something from yesterday about the approximate Zone A floodplain cross sections that are available on our Kansas floodplain viewer. Those are only available in the counties that we have LiDAR maps for. So I just wanted to put that out there. As I said, we do have the BFE portal, and we're going to have the statewide base level engineering. And so, yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. And that is a layer in the Kansas floodplain viewer that you have to turn on. It's not on by default. So you just go into the side panel and turn that layer on. So just clarifying that. And so we can continue today with elevating our floodplain buildings. So we'll be talking more about construction and foundations and then kind of going into substantial improvement, damage, and post-disaster stuff today. And a little bit more about insurance. And so this slide is elevating your floodplain building. Of course, residential structures have to be elevated at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And so we have a couple of different examples here. One of them is on compacted fill. So we have fill dirt that's brought in. It's compacted in a way that has to be compliant. And so I have another slide on the standards for that, but it's about 10 to 15 feet beyond the house for that fill pad to go in. And then of course, taking that out of the floodplain would be the LOMAR F from FEMA. And then the other example we have here is a crawl space. And so this is an empty enclosure that's underneath the structure. You can see it has openings in the wall that allows water to flow in and out automatically. And that equalizes the pressure from outside the structure because without the openings, it could collapse the foundation walls, which would be a pretty major damage to that structure. So that's why those are required. And so the crawl space itself, the interior, is either above or at grade. It's not below grade because if the floor of the crawl space was below grade, that would make it into a basement. And so we have had instances where people have put fill around the outside of a crawl space and then made it into a basement, which is non-compliant. And so that's why we are here to answer questions like that. We could have helped them avoid an issue like that, but additionally, you'll see the service equipment inside these structures. The utilities and electrical circuits are also elevated above the base flood elevation. And so there has been a little bit of mixed messaging on that, but utilities and equipment are required at least to be at or above the base flood elevation, and communities are encouraged to, and they do adopt higher standards for that and typically adopt a foot of freeboard for those as well. So that would be the preferable thing to do to protect those utilities. They are expensive to replace and we're becoming a large part of flood insurance claims. And that's when FEMA made sure that utilities were included in things that had to be elevated. And so, next slide. Okay, so floodplain fill, as I mentioned yesterday, on average, a foot or more of fill is something that's going to need a permit from the state. And so that would be Janelle Phillips in Manhattan. But it is earth infill that's used to raise the ground above the flood elevation and has to be placed in such a way that it's not going to erode or slump or scour when you have floodwaters interacting with it. And so to have safety and floodplain requirements met, we have it graded, sloped sides. So it's a foot of vertical rise for every 1.5 feet of horizontal extent. And so that's the ratio that's required. And then it's protected with vegetation so that we can avoid erosion. And then it's machine compacted. So it's not just, falling apart. And we're using good, clean soil that doesn't have any rocks in it or construction debris and that kind of thing. So we do have other printed or like handouts on these recommendations and requirements, but yeah, so if it was too steep of a slope, the erosion from the water could completely destroy a fill pad, and obviously we want to avoid that, and it would eventually damage the structure. So that's why we have these standards on floodplain fill. So here's an example of a structure that was built on fill. This is in Erie, Kansas. And so it does have rocks on the outside, but the interior fill is good compacted soil. And it did protect this structure from a flood that happened not long after it was built. There was a nearby grocery store that was not on fill. And so that ended up with like 4 feet of water on the inside. And so after that, they elevated that on fill as well. Having fill in the floodplain can make things worse though, because we are displacing water and adding additional surface to the grade. And so there's an example here where you have a house that was properly elevated above the base flood elevation, and then you start adding fill to that and more impervious surfaces, more construction and urban growth and that kind of thing. We're displacing water so that it can't infiltrate the soil anymore. And we're raising the flooding level. As I said, we get complaints pretty often that people are displacing water onto their property. And so it kind of ties back into planning and making sure that growth in a community is, working with the floodplain. That's more preferable because we do run into issues like this, and we don't want to make flooding issues worse. And so impervious surfaces and runoff are a big concern with that. So it typically is done in places where it's not like neighborhoods, it's more rural areas where you have houses that are pretty well spread out so that they are not displacing water onto each other. I think a lot of more dense urban areas wouldn't allow that. And so that kind of goes hand in hand with basements, also not a good idea. So you have floodwater infiltrating the soil. And so as you go down into the soil, that pressure increases linearly with the depth. And so it increases the pressure that's being exerted on the structure. And of course, if you have a basement in there, you just have empty air on the other side. And so that pressure can cause walls to crack. It can burst through the floor with the buoyancy that's being exerted on the bottom of the basement floor. And so it can lift out of the ground. We've seen this with other structures like in-ground pools coming out of the ground, or underground storage tanks at gas stations can bust through the parking lot surface. And so it is a real concern, and part of why we don't let basements be built in the floodplain. So in this example, you have water coming through the basement window as well, which can break quite easily. And then you have water in the basement. And so cleaning and repairing that can be difficult. And basically, foundation walls breaking is a pretty devastating event for a structure. It's expensive to fix. And so back when Steve was a floodplain administrator, and before that, he had a construction job where they would go in and fix basements that had this happen to them. And so they have to, take out a lot of the wall and floor, and then they would have to pour new walls and floors and smooth it out and put in reinforced rebar and stuff. So that's why we don't allow it. And even basements close to the floodplain that are technically allowed are still not a good idea. And so we discourage that as much as we can. And we've been talking about, actually, whenever we see a plan like that that's close to the floodplain, taking a closer look at the data and seeing if we have something updated that might better inform construction close to those areas. So just something to think about. If you do come across a plan like that, we might have more detailed data that could help better inform them, and definitely recommend against putting a basement anywhere near the floodplain or in the 500-year floodplain. And of course, the basement, again, by the FEMA definition, has its floor subgrade on all sides. And then manufactured homes are another thing that come up pretty frequently. They are different from traditional stick-built construction, and so we do have special regulations that only apply to manufactured homes, such as secured into a built-in frame that has anchors that are down into the ground. And so there are publications on how to do anchoring properly, but that would be part of the inspection process, going out and making sure that the anchors are used correctly and that they are properly anchored, because often if a manufactured home is flooded, it's a complete loss. They have a lower market value than traditional buildings, so they are more likely to be substantially damaged. And so there's a diagram here with the reinforcement of the concrete footer that's below even the frost line is something to think about. It has metal dowels, and so you have concrete filled blocks that are reinforced and cemented together, which is important because we have seen manufactured homes that are just sitting on cinder blocks that are not reinforced or attached or anchored in any way. So making sure that that is the case. And also they have elevated utilities up on platforms, as I said, at least to the base flood elevation or higher. But it is common to see these platforms on the outside of structures and manufactured homes to elevate the utilities. So just making sure that they're not below that level. We often see piers, posts, or columns as the type of foundation for the manufactured homes. As I said, cement bricks like this that are at least reinforced and anchored is the proper way of doing it. And so we do have the protecting your manufactured home from flood damage publication from FEMA, and there's a few other publications on that. And so it does come up pretty often. Manufactured homes are often located in the floodplain, and so I did just write an article on that in our newsletter. So if you wanted to look at that or any other resources, I'm happy to provide. So here's a good example of an elevated manufactured home. This one's pretty close to the actual stream, and it is elevated on these piers, and it's properly attached to the piers as well. We have seen cases where they were just kind of resting on the piers, and then they were able to just float away. So we don't want to see that. It needs to be affixed to the post and not just resting there. So this one is properly elevated and permitted and done correctly. It just needs the finishing staircase on that. And then here's a bad example. So this came up in one of our audits, and this is a manufactured home that is just stacked on top of the cinder blocks that are just sitting there. So it's not anchored, it's not attached to the blocks are not reinforced or cemented together, and it's in the floodway. So and it's not elevated high enough either. And it didn't have a no-rise certificate. So basically just everything was wrong here, but it had been sitting there for 9 years in this way. So it was a more difficult thing to fix, and that's what you want to avoid, because I mentioned the statute of limitations being about 5 years, which can take away some of your administrative power. And the longer something's been there, the less inclined the person is going to be to want to fix it. Of course, this is a bad and dangerous situation, so that's why we try to avoid violations and make sure that people understand what the standards are for manufactured homes, and of course, knowing where the floodplain is, and especially the floodways. So bad situation there, and this is also what we want to avoid. This is clearly a dangerous situation. So this flood happened, it was not elevated or anchored, and so it just floated away, and then it floated up against the stream bank, and then these trees just kind of snapped it in half. And so this is definitely a complete loss of this structure. So yes, substantially damaged, but a complete loss. And so manufactured homes often have particle board as part of their construction material, which is definitely not flood damage resistant. And so when it gets completely wet and inundated, it will just fall apart. And so the materials and the nature of manufactured homes often make them very vulnerable to flooding. And so, yeah, so this happened in a manufactured home park where lots of them ended up in the same situation. It was a former meander of the river. So it was an oxbow lake area that had just manufactured fill pads all around them, and then they just weren't anchored or anything. So that's what happened, and we want to avoid that. And then back to enclosures. So crawl space buildings. So this is diagram 8 and 9 on the elevation certificate. So this is another diagram where you can see the enclosure underneath the living floor. There's the lowest floor there at the bottom of the brick, and then the base flood elevation. And then underneath that, you have the enclosure with the flood openings. So it's at least 2 flood openings on different sides. So they don't have to be opposite walls, but just 2 different walls, and then no more than 1 foot above grade. Making sure the interior ground level is at or above. The outside grade, again, you don't want to accidentally make a basement. And then the openings have to be equal to 1 square inch of net opening per every square foot of enclosed space. And so that's the 1-to-1 ratio that's required for enclosures like this. And we'll talk about wet flood proofing, but the requirement for openings, flood openings like that is the same. And so again, that equalizes the pressure. The ductwork that is often found in the crawl space area would also have to be elevated above the base flood elevation. And we have had issues where, like after a flood, companies will come out and they offer to clean ductwork. And so at that point, they used a steamer to try to clean it. And so they were just introducing more moisture to these areas. And so it just was kind of like a mold factory, and a bunch of houses ended up with mold inside their ductwork, which can spread and cause structural damage eventually because of that moisture. And so with all the condensation, it just caused a lot of mold issues. And so we do have issues with these fly-by-night contractors, as we call them. So contractors will just, or people posing as licensed contractors, people kind of scamming people after a disaster, because they will offer discounted work, and you know, people are desperate to repair and recover to their normal lives. And so that's something to watch out for as far as post-disaster stuff. So here's another enclosure. This is a full story enclosure. So this is the diagram 7. And so basically you have a full story enclosure. It's usually functioning like a garage. It's used only for parking, storage, or building access. And then you have your living floor above that. And so you can see the utilities on the outside are elevated up to that first full floor, up to the living floor. And so they will qualify for the machinery and equipment discount. And so I have a slide on that, but basically they have elevated it so it's safe from flooding. And there was a flood in this area. So you can see the high water line on the enclosure, and you can see the flood openings along that wall. And so this is just a garage floor, and they were able to recover after a little bit of light cleaning. And that was it. They were fine. And that structure was inundated for like 2 months. So they were displaced for a long time, but the structure did not suffer any damage. So built in compliance, used as it was supposed to be, the utilities were elevated, and there was no damage to that structure. And as far as flood openings, people really dislike having them in their structures. I'm not sure why it's such a big deal, but people are often boarding them over. And we've heard that it makes the floors cold, and more typically it lets pests in, like raccoons or other animals that could get in through the flood openings. And so they can be covered, and I'll talk a little bit more about coverings, but they can't be completely closed in such a way like this house where they have just boarded over the structure, over the openings. And so in this case, if it were to flood, it could collapse that foundation wall, which I think would be a much more difficult issue to deal with than having raccoons in your crawl space. And so they had to do enforcement on this structure, have them uncover the openings, and then sometime later they found them to be recovered again. So it was kind of a back and forth with this property owner, and so they kind of have it on a permanent watch list now to make sure that the flood openings are still there. But yeah, that's something to watch out for, definitely during inspections or periodic inspections, or whenever you're just kind of driving around, hopefully keeping an eye on your floodplain to look out for people covering the flood vents, because again, that's pretty common. So here's another example where they've been boarded up. Yeah, so again, just a bad idea as to what can happen if you don't have flood openings or if they are closed. So this is a collapsed wall, and this happened in Mulvane at a time when our team happened to be in the area. The downtown Mulvane flooded, and so this is what happened. And it's masonry construction, which is typically the most reinforced, but the foundation wall here has busted out because of the pressure from floodwaters. And so engineered openings are an option. So they are a little bit more expensive, but basically they just open and close. There's like a little floating mechanism inside, and they automatically open and close with rising floodwater. And so people can buy those and have it closed, and then it just opens automatically without any human intervention. And so that's the requirement for openings, is there cannot be any human intervention for them to work. And so you can find them online. They're like maybe $100 each, but they are certified and rated for a certain net opening. And so if someone's structure is already built and there's not enough openings on it, they can get engineered openings, and it might save them from having to do a full retrofit where they make more openings. So it can actually save people money, and it will fix the issue with them not wanting it open all the time. As I said, you can have coverings that are a little bit more common and not as expensive. So this is the non-engineered opening guide, and it's basically just a guide of common coverings that you would see, and it kind of just guides you through typically the net opening that you're going to see for that, to make sure that any coverings that are used are still going to leave you with enough net opening to meet that 1-to-1 ratio. And so anything like this that has slides or louvres, like a vent that can open and close, has to be permanently disabled in the opening or in the open position. Because as I said, it has to work with no human intervention. So it has to be permanently open, but you can have grates, louvres, vents, whatever type of covering you want, as long as you have enough net opening. And so this guide might save you a little bit of time. We only have a few hard copies, but it is available online. And it has lots of pictures in there, and you can find lots of different types of openings to tell you how many square inches it's worth. So you can just look that up online. And then flood openings are part of section A8 on the elevation certificate. For now, that could change with the new elevation certificate, but I'll definitely be sending out information once that's released. So looking back at crawl spaces again, so you can see the construction here with the exterior and interior grade being even, and then you have the foot depth per the building code, so the foundation walls that extend into the ground, and then you have the opening closure and the flood openings here. Basically doing inspections to make sure that the flood openings are at least within 1 foot above grade, making sure that the ductwork is at least above the base flood elevation, preferably having some kind of freeboard, and then of course the lowest floor is at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So just kind of another diagram looking at the inside of the crawl space. As we said, ductwork should be hopefully 1 foot above base flood elevations, especially for CRS communities. If you're a class 8 or higher at this point, there is a requirement to have machinery and equipment freeboard for residential structures. So that's just something to make note of. And then we looked at a couple of examples of utility services that are outside the building being elevated on platforms. So typically we're looking at heat pumps, and AC units are probably the most common, but also fuel or propane tanks. And sometimes they are left on the ground, which is definitely not preferable. Especially for residential structures, we'd like to see them elevated at the very least, because some things can happen. So this example is a propane tank that was left on the ground. It's anchored, but it does have this kind of clamshell lid design, so that if it's submerged, that the fuel can just leak out of it. And so it's not as much of a problem in this area in Kansas, but we do have the FEMA guide on protection of utilities. And so, as I mentioned, you might just give out those publications when you do permits. It's a good time to educate people on how to protect their utilities and their structures. And so that publication has all the different types of utilities discussed, lots of pictures and diagrams, and it goes through all the different methods of protection that can be used. So for wastewater, electricity, all of that. And so in this example, it's rusting through, the bottom of this is just rusted out, and it's not attached to the cinder blocks. It is kind of attached to the ground. It's not done very well. And so I do have another example of elevated utilities here. So they're on platforms, and this is typical to see now. And so, people don't want to replace these utilities because they're expensive. This is what's preferred. So you can see the high water line on this one where the AC unit was submerged, and that's typically going to be a complete loss of that unit. And so that's what we're trying to avoid, and where FEMA saw a lot of the claim payouts going to submerged utilities. And so again, inside an enclosure, they should be elevated on a platform or something like that, just to keep them above that water level. And you can see the flood opening from the inside here. Okay, and then so under risk rating 2.0, that covers all flood insurance policies now. There is a number of discounts that can be applied to the premium, and so there is a mitigation credit for machinery and equipment to be elevated. There's also one for having proper flood venting. And so it kind of depends on the type of structure that you have, how high your utilities have to be elevated. And so if it's slab on grade, it has to be to the next floor or higher. And if it's a 1-story building, that would be to the attic level or higher. Basement, it is elevated to the height of the floor above the basement or higher. So that might just be the living floor at that point. If it's elevated without an enclosure, it's to the living floor. The same thing with partial enclosure, it's to that next higher floor. The same thing with the diagram 7, full story enclosure to the living floor, the next higher floor. And then the crawl space, it's to the floor above the crawl space or higher. So it seems a little bit unfair, I guess, if someone has a basement that it's just on the living floor, whereas if you have a slab on grade building, it has to be up to the attic level, but that's just how it's written now. And so for building coverage, that's the AC furnace, the heat pump, any elevator equipment, and for contents coverage, it would be the clothes washer and dryer and food freezers. And so it used to be under the legacy system that if you didn't have your machinery and equipment elevated, you could be penalized by that, by having them rate your insurance policy based on the floor that the utilities were on, and that is no longer the case. Machinery and equipment does not impact the rating floor or any other part of the premium, except if you get this discount. So that's a pretty big switch from how it was before, where it could definitely impact someone's premium. So there is a little bit of disconnect between floodplain management and insurance at this point. And so that might change in the future, but not just yet. And so I wanted to spend some time talking about floodproofing and the two different types and how they're done and how they're applied in floodplain management. And so FEMA defines floodproofing as a combination of adjustments or additions of features to buildings that eliminate or reduce the potential for flood damage. And usually we're referring to either wet or dry floodproofing. In some of the resources I'll be talking about today, there is guidance on mixing these two approaches between wet and dry. So if you want to know more about floodproofing and all of the details of that, definitely check out some of the publications I'll be talking about. But basically, wet floodproofing is what we were looking at with the flood openings and crawl spaces. You have flood openings that allow water into the enclosure or into the structure. And when I say the structure, I mean exclusively accessory and agricultural structures. So it allows water in to neutralize that pressure from the outside, and it evens it out. And so as long as it's built properly, it shouldn't cause any damage. It will prevent the damage. And so we're allowing the water inside, which would be documented by the permit and or elevation certificate when applicable, and or the variance when that's applicable. And so we'll talk about the different situations and how that is authorized. Whereas dry floodproofing, which is only for non-residential structures, is a combination of measures that make the building and utilities watertight and substantially impermeable to floodwater. And so it has these structural components with the capacity to resist flood loads. And so this is a large engineering project that we don't even have any examples that I can think of in Kansas, but I just wanted to make it clear about the requirements for dry floodproofing so that there's an understanding of what it is and how it works. Just so you have some familiarity with the differences in floodproofing, and because the word floodproofing is often just used by itself, and so I wanted to make the distinction clear. And so that would definitely have an elevation certificate, a permit, and it would require the floodproofing certificate. And so there might be some changes coming down the pipe on the floodproofing certificate, and so I'm not sure when that's going to be released, but that might be changing here soon. So for dry floodproofing, I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about this before I get to the wet floodproofing. If you have an existing structure and you're thinking about dry floodproofing it, we have to assess the site and just determine if it is even able to be dry floodproofed. There's a lot of characteristics to take under advisement if you're thinking about doing this. What's its existing vulnerability and how is it going to perform under flooding conditions? We have to assess the architectural and structural integrity of this building, the envelope, the utility systems, and then where is it and what kind of flood threats does it have? What type of warning time? The functional use requirements, how long can this structure be shut down for? Safety and access before, during, and after the flooding conditions. And so these variables are going to play the integral role on whether or not you can dry floodproof an existing building. Whereas the other option would be to just dry floodproof from the start of construction, which would be probably the preferable option if it's built to withstand its expected flood loads. And so you can see this is already developing into a more complicated situation. And utilities, we have to floodproof them somehow. Elevating would be the best thing, but you can build them their own enclosures, or you can make sure that they're designed to be submerged or something like that. And then we'll get into the required plans. And so this is kind of based on the new dry flood proofing technical bulletin 3 that was released, I think last year sometime, 2021, so pretty recently. In the last couple of years, they expanded what is required for dry flood proofing and just put in a lot of clarifications. So if you want to know more about it, definitely look at technical bulletin 3 that was released not long ago. But basically the dry flood proof building has to comply with the design requirements, which means ACE 24. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Reduce damage below the protection level. And so the protection level is the height of the flood proofing, how high on this building it's flood proofed. Provide safe and responsible deployment of active measures. So active measures have human interaction, passive measures work by themselves. Have feasible implementation, maintenance, and operation. And so all of that is going to be detailed in their own plans, and then a level of residual risk that's acceptable to the owner. So there's always residual risk, that is the remaining exposure to loss after all of the measures have been implemented. We can still fail higher water than the expected flood levels that could overtake the floodproofing measures. It could be inundated longer than you think, and the longer things soak, the more damage they take on. Any of the floodproofing systems could fail and then allow water into the building. And then it's kind of all for naught. You have functional use, and how much of that risk can be offset by your insurance policy. And so how much insurance are you buying to try to offset that risk? And so you could have unidentified points of entry for water. If they are not following the maintenance plans and you have poorly maintained measures, they're more likely to fail. Insufficient resistance to flood loads, so that's a calculation that has to be done. And if it's not done correctly, then you could have issues or a failure to implement the active measures. So again, that's human interaction for the active measures. So someone has to go in there and deploy these measures, whereas passive measures are just installed and they should work. So again, that's why the flood warning time heavily impacts the design of a dry flood proofing structure. And so, oops, okay. So as I mentioned, active and passive measures. So there are different types of devices that can be installed to accomplish this. So this is just a small subset of examples that are listed in the introduction of the technical bulletin. So you have reinforcement of the actual structural elements of that building, watertight doors and windows. And so you have like water sealing panels that can go in for the doors and the windows, paints and membranes that are water resistance, sealants. You have to have some kind of sump pump in there, and it has to be able to like withstand, was it 4 inches of water for every 24 hours, something like that. Backflow valves, shut-off valves, flood shields. It's, I think, required that you have a backup generator of some kind for the sump pump, and then window glazing or aquarium glass is reinforced glass for windows. And so again, all of these implementations would be site specific. You would pick out the implementations that would work for that particular flood zone and the velocities and all of that. So as I said, flood warning time for active measures, you have to deploy someone after you've recognized the threat and what type of anticipated storm conditions you're looking at. They have to locate, activate, and deploy all of those measures, which could require heavy equipment or some kind of technical knowledge of how to do that. And then they have to evacuate safely on some kind of predetermined evacuation route. And there could be road closures, and any number of issues could go wrong here. So that's why they have detail the instructions and having these emergency operations plans and having your trained personnel and all of that. And so the insurance regulations are codified in the CFR, and it does talk about dry floodproofing buildings and having at least 1 foot of freeboard above the base flood elevation. So it has to be dry floodproof to at least 1 foot of freeboard for you to get the count, for it to count towards insurance. And so of course, state and local requirements take precedent on that. So it has to, follow the regulations that are in place in that community for dry floodproofing stuff. Okay. So as I said, the ACE 24 or ASCE 24 is a publication that goes hand in hand with the International Building Code, or IBC, which is part of the International Code Council, or ICC. Family of building codes. And so the Technical Bulletin 3 has clarified that a dry floodproofing design has to comply with the ACE 24 publication, and then that goes into all of the technical engineering requirements that would have to be implemented for the dry floodproofing stuff. And so the IBC and ACE 24 pretty much go above and beyond the NFIP minimum requirements. So the definition is about the same. The general flood hazard area requirements exceeds the NFIP. Flood hazard documentation, the certificate is the same. The elevation of the dry floodproofing design exceeds the NFIP, so they have like a whole flood design elevation that has to be determined based on these site-specific conditions, and then the dry floodproofing requirements exceeds the NFIP. There are 2 very small exceptions to that, but not even really worth mentioning. So the elevation is specified as either the freeboard or the design flood elevation, whichever is higher, and then the dry floodproofing requirements are more specific on like the soil or the fill type, what kind of soil you're working with. It has to be compacted and protected. They put limitations on how many active measures you can have. And then there's a requirement to also have an emergency escape access that's above the dry floodproofing design. And then, as I mentioned, there's 2 required plans. You have emergency operations and then inspections and maintenance plans. And so that has to be part of a design that has active floodproofing measures. And so the community should require the submission of these plans to the community official because it also has to be part of the certificates that they sign and seal that the design, is going to withstand the base flood. So again, these plans are going to be required for them to get insurance coverage and get the credit for dry floodproofing measures, and then FEMA is going to do a full review of those plans and the design to determine their eligibility. And so inspections have to be done annually. That's repair or replacement of faulty devices that are going to be used, adjustments to the operations after a flood event. So you have to go in and evaluate how that event went down and then make adjustments to your operations plans. And you can even require them to submit a report from an impartial third party to do a review of their plans. And so I don't have to go through all of this, but I just wanted to show you what all elements are required for the emergency operations requirements. So as I said, it's a large undertaking to try to dry floodproof either an existing structure or design a new structure that is going to be dry floodproofed. And so you have all of these site specific things like conditions that will allow for active measures. Just having a decision tree and a timeline for notifying your personnel. You have to train the personnel, making sure they have all the equipment that they're going to need, and the requirements for installation, the instructions, contact information for the manufacturer. And so yeah, it's just a lot that go into it. The original technical bulletin only had like 5 things on this list. The same thing for inspection and maintenance plans, to go through and inspect and maintain all of these different elements, including your sump pumps and your interior drain system. And so you have lots to do, and that's going to be an annual activity that you would do. And then the technical bulletin also has this design flow chart. And so it's just kind of a visualization of this process of how you would design or determine if floodproofing is appropriate, and then go through that whole process. So it's a lot: flood protection level, flood loads, the condition assessment, design and structural elements, the utility systems, flood shields, the waterproofing system, and your interior drainage system also has to be certified. So all of it is going to end up being certified, either by an architect or an engineer. Surveyors cannot do dry flood proofing. And of course, there is always the risk of failure, as I said, residual risk, and FEMA has included their observations of damage that have been contributed to the failure of dry flood proofing over time, just so that they can, better advise potential dry flood proofers. So lack of plans that had this detail about installation and inspection and maintenance plans that didn't have enough detail. Ownership of the building could change, and then some people were just totally unaware of the dry flood proofing system. You could have missing or damaged elements, modification of these components by uninformed maintenance people who could unknowingly adjust something, and then the active measure will not install. And so that's why these plans are a critical component to the effectiveness of a dry flood proofing design, because if they're deficient, then the entire system is going to be deficient. And so that's probably why dry flood proofing is not very common. But again, there is a new dry flood proofing certificate that should be coming out. But as I said, if you are going to dry flood proof, then they have to have this certificate. And then we do have the residential basement exemption. And so this is an exemption from FEMA granted to a community to allow people to have residential basements that are flood proofed. So it has to be flood proof to at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation, have the top of the floor no lower than 5 feet below the base flood elevation, have adequate fill around the building, and then design and method of construction is certified. And so we only have 10 communities that have this exemption, and we had a lot of issues with it in one community in particular. And so I don't think FEMA is keen on this whole program, and I think most of the communities that we have in it are no longer like permitting these types of basements. But basically, this exemption is allowed for communities and areas that have shallow and low velocity flooding, adequate warning times, and then the basement, as with the definition of floodproofing, has to be impermeable to the passage of water and built to withstand the hydrostatic and dynamic pressures that include buoyancy to the floodproof design level. And so they're supposed to be designed for minimum damage. And again, we have had cases in Kansas where the water flooded a basement that was either under construction or the floodproofing had failed. And so, yeah, it's difficult to do. And then there's a separate residential basement floodproofing certificate. So this is a different document than the dry floodproofing certificate. And then we have had communities do this that were not part of the program, and so the developer didn't know that it was a separate program that you had to be part of before you can, certify this document and put it in a basement. And so that is a violation. And they ended up building a basement that was like 6 feet below ground, 8 feet below the base flood elevation, and the floodplain administrator in that community was an engineer. and they use the non-residential floodproofing certificate without the correct construction requirements, and they're not the same, and they're not documented the same. So yeah, a dry floodproof basement for a non-residential structure does not have to adhere to the same elevation rules as the residential basement. So it was just built completely wrong, and so hopefully you can avoid a situation like that. That did not go well, but basically in that situation, they would have to fill in that basement. But this is what it looks like for the residential basement. You have like the basic property information, and then it asks about the floodproofing elevation, and then it's signed and certified by, again, either an engineer or an architect, not a surveyor. So yeah, just the different parts of that. And so there is an insurance discount now under Risk Rating 2.0 for floodproof basements that are a part of this program. Again, FEMA has approved the basement floodproofing premium discount, and it's located in a floodplain. So it's actually in the SFHA. And then again, non-residential buildings can have basements, but not in a V zone and in a participating NFIP community. So the discount depends on the level of floodproofing. So yeah, there's just all of these caveats to this discount. And you probably won't have to work with it very much unless you're in one of those communities, but just something to be aware of. Okay, so accessory structures are something that come up extremely common in the floodplain. As I said, they just kind of pop up without people realizing they need permits. And so for an accessory structure, it would have to be elevated, or we have the option of wet floodproofing it if it meets the specific requirements. And so FEMA has clarified that we can wet floodproof accessory structures with just a permit. It doesn't have to have a variance as long as it meets the requirements. It's not habitable. It's properly anchored. It has the 1-to-1 ratio of flood openings, no more than 1 foot above grade, flood damage resistant materials. If there are any utilities, those would have to be elevated above the base flood elevation, and then that's where the elevation certificate would come in, just to make sure that those utilities are elevated. Otherwise, it doesn't have to have an elevation certificate if it's wet flood proofed. It's used only for parking or storage. It cannot be modified in use later on. And I'm forgetting something. But yeah, 600 square feet. It has to be 600 square feet or less, and that is more than what it used to be 400 feet, and now they allow it up to 600 square feet, which is about the size of a 2-car garage. And if it's any larger than that, it would need a variance. And, we would recommend that it doesn't go much larger than 600 square feet. And so information, even like a page or a handout like this slide, might be something to give to people, or like include in your annual mailer, or put it on social media, or whatever the case may be, just to try to make sure that people are aware of what's required for them to have an accessory structure, and especially if they're going to wet floodproof it. Otherwise, they can elevate it. So here's an example of an elevated accessory structure, and the utilities are elevated up on that wall as well. So here's a bad example. We've seen lots of bad examples of accessory structures, some that are just kind of like hodgepodge thrown together structures that are definitely not flood damage resistant, and it doesn't have flood openings. And if you look closer, it's just kind of resting on firewood. It's not any kind of actual anchoring or foundation system on this. The materials are wrong. I said no vents. It might also be a local code enforcement issue. So a lot of violations have this overlap with code enforcement. The same thing here, definitely has all of the same issues: no openings, not elevated, not anchored, the wrong materials, and it might also be a code enforcement violation. So watching out for stuff like that. And then agricultural structures are the other structures that can be wet flood proofed, and FEMA has clarified that agricultural structures have to have a variance for this, and that is because they are so variable in use and what they are that it can't just be verified by a permit alone. We have to verify that it meets the definition of an agricultural structure. And so again, it would have the same requirements of being anchored, floodproofing materials, flood vents. Some of these, like a pole barn, has a full open wall, and we have been able to count a full open wall with no door as having flood openings, but not if there is a door on that. So this is used solely for agricultural purpose in connection with the production, harvesting, storage, drying, or raising of agricultural commodities that includes livestock. And it can be wet flood proofed as long as there's no human habitation or occupancy of that structure, of single wall design, and importantly, no retail, wholesale, or manufacturing is included in that use. And I have had some run-ins with like pumpkin sales and that type of like agritainment, they call it, that type of structure that has some kind of retail or wholesale use. And that doesn't count as an agricultural structure. And so that would have to meet the regular non-residential structure requirements. And so that's just something else to be aware of. And that it, would meet the other floodplain management requirements, has a permit and a variance. And so they don't say it can't have a variance because obviously the community has authority on what variances are allowed and what's not, but they say livestock confinement, that type of building where it says variances are not allowed for livestock, poultry, milking parlors, and that kind of thing because they can pose a danger to health, safety, and welfare. They're a little bit more posing a risk or danger to the public. And so those should be located outside of the special flood hazard area if they can, or be elevated or dry flood proofed. And so here's a good example. This has flood openings. There is no size limitation on agricultural structures, whereas the accessory structures have that 600 square foot limit. And then this would be, certified that it has the floodproofing materials. Obviously, any utilities would also have to be elevated and be on an elevation certificate. But otherwise, it could just have a permit and a variance. And so FEMA has released policy guidance on this. They have this policy from 2020 that clarifies going through the granting of variances. It supersedes the previous technical bulletins. And it also talks about accessory structures in this policy. And accessory structures, I should have mentioned, have to be on the same parcel of property as the principal structure and incidental to the use of that structure. And so I have had a property where there's an accessory structure in every sense of the word, except that it didn't have a principal structure, and so it wouldn't count as an accessory. So definitely something else to be aware of. Agricultural structures only, if they are substantially damaged by a flood that can be repaired. Other hazards, it would have to meet the elevation or dry flood proofing requirements. So we'll talk more about substantial damage in a little bit, but no disaster assistance, and that's in our ordinance language for these structures, that there would be no disaster assistance, and make sure that it's properly wet flood proofed, or it would be ineligible for insurance. And so basically this is an exemption to reduce the burden on low damage potential structures like this. So yeah, walled and roofed, so that wouldn't include holding pens or tanks or pools, no habitation, and no employment or entertainment, which often goes back to these agritainment type of operations. Employment and entertainment should not be part of that. Skip the slide. Nope. Okay. So some communities do require that accessory structures also have a variance to be wet flood proofed, and that's not a bad thing to have, in making sure that it has all of these requirements. And so FEMA does discourage variances as much as possible, but this is kind of a different type of variance, if you will, to allow for wet flood proofing, because it kind of, goes hand in hand with low damage potential stuff and having that exemption. So just putting that out there. And then this is the other publication that came out in July of 2020. It's a longer version of that policy. It has more definitions and examples. It has specific construction standards and how to combine wet and dry flood proofing, as I mentioned earlier. Development that's not considered to be structures, administrative variance responsibilities, and the type of ag structures that might be too dangerous and pose too much of a threat to public health, safety, and welfare that shouldn't be wet flood proofed. And it also has model language for your ordinance. Okay, and with that, it's 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and do our first poll question. If you want credit for today's class, I need you to participate in this poll question, and then we'll take a quick break. So what structures can be authorized for wet flood proofing? And I'll give you about 30 seconds to answer that. Check all that apply. It's multiple choice on that. I don't see anyone participating.
I can see answers coming in.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I think it showed me yesterday, but not today. Okay, we'll give
Okay,
you like,
that's oh, I think that's because I forgot to make you co-host. So let me do that. Cheyenne, I apologize.
oh, it's okay.
Maybe you should be able to see it now.
Yeah, I see it now.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks.
Sorry about that.
And I think we can go ahead and end polling. Okay, so for wet flood proofing, that would be agricultural structures and accessory structures. Definitely not residential structures. So I definitely want to make that clear. Wet flood proofing is only for ag structures and accessory structures, definitely not residential. Non-residential structures that don't meet those definitions would have to be elevated or dry flood proofed as well. So I hope that makes it a little bit more clear. And so let's take a quick 5-minute break. If you want to come back at 10:07, we'll finish up the last part of this class. Did I say 10:06 or 10:07? Should we give it another minute or?
I think you said 10:07, but
Okay. Okay, so hopefully everyone is back and we will just finish the last part here. So, so what's wrong here? Just looking at more bad examples of structures, and we do see all kinds of structures that are definitely not constructed properly in the floodplain. It comes up in our audits. So it's clearly not elevated. It's definitely not made of flood damage resistant material. There's no flood venting. As I said before, it could be a local code enforcement issue. And so, yeah, what turned out with this structure is that it's just kind of C-shaped horseshoe structure that has like trees in the middle. And then they would have like cockfights in there. I don't know. Steve would tell me about this particular building. I guess you can see some like birds out front. But yeah, these types of issues do pop up every now and then. RVs are another concern that we have. So there are specific standards for recreational vehicles in the floodplain. So they can be there no less than 180 days consecutively. They need to be fully licensed and ready for highway use, meaning they basically have like a license plate and air in the tires. And then if they can't meet that requirement, they would have to be elevated and anchored in the same way that a manufactured home is elevated and anchored. And so there are RV parks that have had this 180-day RV parade. So everyone gets out and they kind of drive around in a loop and then they repark so that they don't surpass the 180 consecutive days, which is fine. I think it demonstrates that all of these RVs are on quick disconnect utilities and are, ready for highway use. So that's not a bad solution, and we don't want to have people, out in their RVs during a flood, and so they should be watching that. So it says camping near water, ask them about their flood warnings and plans, and so it's not a bad idea to check in with RV parks on what their flood plans are, just to avoid any safety issues. So here we have a water rescue happening within an RV park. And so I guess this is in Harvey County, a wooded area. And some people just didn't check the weather before they went camping. So unfortunately, they ended up in a bad situation. And so we're kind of moving more into substantial damage and improvements here. And so pre-firm buildings that were built before we have modern flood data, and it's a pre-firm structure if it was built on or before December 31st, 1974, or before the effective date of the first firm. And so if it's built after that date or the effective firm, whichever is later, it would be considered post-firm. And so hopefully a post-firm structure has been built, properly elevated, and considering more of the flood potential damage that could happen. And so, as I mentioned, in Kansas, a lot of structures have had basements because they were worried more about tornado safety than floods. And so in that way, FEMA really recommends safe rooms more than definitely more than a basement. And so that's a separate issue, but theoretically, a post-firm building is elevated. Sometimes a structure is built before it was mapped into the floodplain, and so then they're not elevated high enough, even if they are post-firm. And so I talked yesterday about Hurricane Agnes and the mandatory purchase requirement, and so that kind of ties into this. And so before this past October and before, I guess this past April actually is when everything went to risk rating 2.0. Pre and post firm structures had different insurance rates. And now that is part of it, but they are taking into consideration all of the other elements and factors that we looked at yesterday. And so again, pre-firm structures not as resilient to flood damage. So this is an example of one. And so improvements, so any improvement to structures in the floodplain should, be permitted and then also have the cost of those improvements included. And then we have to consider the cost of those improvements to the market value of that structure to determine if it's a substantial improvement. And then having that on file, on record, to compare to any other improvements that are done within the next calendar year, unless you have cumulative improvement standards, and then it's usually 5 years for that. So in this example, we have a structure that has $110,000 value, and then the cost of those improvements are $68,500. And so the total building value is then $178,500. And so again, when it's substantially improved, we have to have it come into compliance with the current regulations, just so that they're not consistently putting in more money to a structure without incorporating that flood safety concern in the floodplain. So this house had all of these additions put on. It's got a deck added to it, but it has been elevated entirely on a crawl space, and it has the flood openings on it. So it has been brought into compliance, and that's really all we're looking for, is that it's elevated properly and it's done compliantly. So elevating an existing structure can be quite expensive, but again, you don't want to put in a whole lot of investment into a house and then lose all of it in a flood. So manufactured homes, going back to that, they are worth less typically than your traditional stick-built construction, and so their threshold for hitting the substantial improvement at 50%, I'm not sure if I said that, sorry, substantial improvement and damage, if it's 50% of the market value. So if it exceeds that, it's considered substantial improvement or damage if it's been damaged. And so in this case, it's an older manufactured home. It's only worth about $500. So if you put on any improvement that's worth more than $250 for materials and labor, so we have to count any labor even if it's donated, then it would have to meet the standards of that community and come into compliance and be elevated. And so this is not really a compliant structure anyways. It's kind of going back to bad examples of things that happen in the floodplain, but so this is clearly too low, and it's a substantial improvement on this, but it's just covered in a tarp, and it was a pre-firm structure. And so substantial improvements and lateral additions, if it's structurally connected, then they both would have to comply. And so I have a little bit more information on that. But as far as additions, we have to consider on whether or not they're structurally connected, meaning they are sharing a common wall. And so in this example, it is an addition, a lateral addition onto a manufactured home, but it's actually not structurally connected. It's just kind of against that wall, and they're not sharing that common wall. And so this was also less than 50% of the market value, so it was not a substantial improvement. And so substantial improvement and damage are really the same thing. And so that's why I've kind of put them together here, and they're kind of mixed in together in these next couple of slides. But the value of repairs to the pre-damage condition, or the value of those improvements, is what we're considering and putting against the fair market value. So this would be the fair market value if we're talking about damage, then prior to the damage, what it was, and that would include any depreciation that's happened. And so we compare that, the cost of compares to return it to its pre-damage condition, and if that is 50% or more than the market value, then it's considered to be substantially damaged. And so when damage happens to structures in the floodplain from any cause, it doesn't have to be flooding, it could be a tornado or fire or whatever the case may be, then we have to go out and do an assessment on those structures and send them an official determination from the floodplain administrator, from that community official, on what their level of damage is determined to be. And because they're going to need that determination to make an ICC claim on their flood insurance, which is the increased cost of compliance, and that helps them to bring the structure into compliance if it's been substantially damaged. So we do have the substantial damage estimator software, and I have a couple of slides on that. And so it's basically a pretty simple, straightforward software that you can use, and you plug in all of this information, and it gives you a summary of the damage, and it can help kind of streamline and make the process a little bit more consistent. And then, of course, we have people, you know, that want to appeal your decision. There should be an appeals process for that. So if you don't agree with my damage estimation, then you can provide information from an appraisal if you're contesting the market value, or from a licensed contractor if we're talking about the cost of repairs. And of course, I said the pre-damage condition, so that doesn't mean the cost of bringing it up to current code. And so the structure's pre-damage value, the fair market value, which is like the amount that two free people would agree to, but neither of them are required to agree, either, you know, the sale, you know, that amount of money. So that's typically how market value is defined. And there's a couple of different ways to find it. An appraisal is definitely an acceptable you know, source for that, as long as we're not including the land value, nothing to do with the property, just the structure itself. The other most common one is the tax assessment records, because that's public information, and if they you know, when they're doing their property taxes, if they didn't agree with that market value, they had the opportunity at that point to dispute it. And so that's another common, reliable one. A bill of sale, if it's been a recent sale. As I said, depreciation plays into this. So if it's been a long time, that is probably not the best source. And then the insurance settlement is also something to watch out for. Some properties are underinsured, or they might have a high deductible, and of course the depreciation, as I said. So if the insurance payout isn't for the full amount of damage, then you wouldn't want to use those figures for your estimations. And so, right. So you have these different sources for market value. Just make sure that you're being consistent with all of the assessments that you do. And again, this is another place where written administrative procedures would come in handy, to have that and make sure that you are treating people fairly and consistently, because otherwise you might have some kind of liability issues and people might complain if you're doing it differently. So whatever process you choose, that's fine, just be consistent with it. And as far as damage, we're talking about the cost of materials, the fair market value for costs of supplies, and that might vary geographically. And so there are like Marshall and Swift books and residential cost estimation guides that you can buy, or you the tax assessor. Someone in your community might already have some of these books that you can borrow because they are pretty expensive. And the cost of labor also includes volunteer labor. If the person's going to do some work themselves, we have to consider the cost that qualified labor would cost, and that has to be included. But we're not including debris removal, cleanup, building plans. Permit fees can be waived, and they're not included in the cost of repairs. Also, any emergency repairs to make the building safe is not counted. And as I mentioned yesterday, I think briefly, any cited code violations. So any code violations to a residential or more likely a non-residential structure that has already been cited by a community official does not count. And so definitely check out the substantial damage desk reference for this. And I hope you have a post-disaster plan in place, because you don't want to be scrambling after a disaster and people are trying to repair and you're going to be very stressed out and busy. And so having these things in place beforehand will help you a lot. And definitely always let us know if there's any flooding issues. So this is just kind of a more comprehensive list of everything that's included. And so it's pretty straightforward on costs included, like all of those materials, anything that is on or part of the structure. That includes built-in appliances, not plug-in appliances. So the costs excluded here, anything to do with the surrounding property, like lighting or landscaping, that kind of stuff, not included. The permit fees, as I said, temporary stabilization, cleanup, and existing code violations, that kind of thing. So just good to be aware of this, and definitely having your inspectors trained on what all is going to be included when you're doing your damage assessment. And that includes deferred maintenance is not counted as damage, such as things that were already an issue before, like peeling paint and shingles and that kind of stuff. Because they were that way before the disaster event. And again, we're talking about pre-damage condition, not pristine condition. And so again, having all of this spelled out in writing, having the same rules for everybody, and then having those written rules approved by and the governing body is familiar with it, that can be helpful to you. So I highly recommend written administrative procedures. So some communities just tell everyone to go ahead and get a licensed contractor estimate and then turn it into the local floodplain administrator. And we do have several communities that do that, and that's perfectly reasonable. More quick tips, a few common mistakes. Brick veneer. It can be tricky if you're not used to it, but yeah, it's basically a type of siding. It's not the same as brick construction, so just being aware of that. Uninhabitable, so there are multiple entities, state, federal, and local, that might be going through and doing inspections for different things. And so making sure people are aware that different groups are coming by to inspect different things is an important part. And so I'll talk about outreach, but just because it says uninhabitable doesn't mean it's substantially damaged. They could just be talking about a gas leak. Or it could be, a much larger issue, like the entire foundation is unstable. It just depends, and that goes along with doing the damage assessment on what exactly is damaged and how badly. And so another interesting thing is apartment buildings are technically businesses, and so you would be using a non-residential assessment for an apartment building. Whereas in other areas of floodplain management, an apartment building is considered residential because it has residential use, and so would have to meet the residential standards for buildings. So a little bit of, disconnect there, maybe, potentially. And again, this house could be substantially damaged. You might not see that on your windshield inspection, and so we suggest you start by just driving around and getting kind of an idea of the areas that are damaged and how badly. So it turns out in this house, the entire back side of the foundation is just kind of hanging out over open ground, and so it's not stable. It's just kind of empty underneath the foundation in the back, and so that's not something you would see from the front. You would have to, do the inspection inside and going around the outside. And of course, safety is of utmost concern. You do have to be very careful and vigilant when you're inspecting a damaged structure. As I wrote about in my recent article in our newsletter, if you're not getting our newsletter, definitely let me know so I can put you on that list. But you know, electric shock is a huge concern. As I said, gas leaks could be happening. Any number of things could be wrong with a structure and cause you harm. So just being careful, making sure that you don't do inspections until something like downed power lines have been cleaned up, because again, it can be dangerous. We had one house where after a flood, a couple of days later, they went in to do assessments and there was like an entire snake den. So a bunch of snakes had, you know, tried to get out of the water and just ended up inside this house. And so anything can happen. Just again, yeah, being careful. So the entire back half of this house is just hanging out suspended over the air. And so it does have a substantial damage tag on it and it says uninhabitable and all of that. So you start with your windshield inspection and you make a list of what's low damage, what's definitely high damage, and what you think is medium damaged. And then you actually start with the medium damage. And so we do have a post-flood responsibility class coming up, which I, of course, highly recommend that you come and attend that. And so I mentioned the desk reference for substantial improvements and damage. And then this decision tree is really helpful. I use it all the time in these types of cases when people ask me questions. So it has a couple of columns. So the building is pre-firm or post-firm. And then on the left side, what type of work it is and whether or not it's a substantial improvement. And then it tells you what kind of compliance is needed. So a vertical addition above a building that's not a substantial improvement on a pre-firm building, it doesn't have to comply. On a post-firm building, it has to comply and not make the building non-compliant. And so this decision table is really helpful. Definitely get the desk reference. It's available online. And non-substantial improvements, of course, they don't have to comply if it's less than 50% of the market value. And of course, we're counting one full calendar year or more, depending on your standards. One full calendar year is the default. But if it's not, we should still be encouraging people to try to make sure that their improvements are, you know, flood damage resistant. So encourage them to raise their utilities a little bit higher, using flood damage resistant materials for any like rehabilitation or whatever type of work that they're doing. Add flood openings to crawl space foundations if it didn't have that already as like a pre-firm structure or something like that. Move the ductwork out of the crawl space. Fill in a below grade crawl space. And so again, all of these have to have permits, but we are talking about non-substantial improvements. Just encouraging people to mitigate flood risk where they can. And then, of course, permit review, you have to review the costs of either damage or improvement, have those records. I would recommend, especially for post-disaster stuff, just having an inventory of all of your floodplain properties and structures, just having that inventory, maybe in the SDE software is a good place to keep it, and then just try to work with the appraiser or work with whoever in your county might have these records and try to keep up with what the market value is maybe annually. And I know that's maybe a large undertaking for a lot of floodplain administrators that have a lot of work and a lot of jobs that they do within the community, but I think it is worth the time and definitely saving time post-disaster because people are trying to rush and repair and they all have to have permits and assessments before they can do that. And so you are really short on time and you're going to be stressed out. As I said, people are going to be asking you all kinds of questions and you're doing press releases and this and that. And so just having this information already available to you will definitely help save time. So definitely check out our post-disaster class. Again, it has to be brought into compliance if the damage or improvement exceeds that 50% threshold. And then encouraging owners to consider other ways they can reduce future damage. And as I said, cumulative improvement is a standard that you can adopt into your ordinance. It's a higher standard. So yeah, commonly it's 5 years instead of the 1 calendar year that is the default. I think this is worth CRS points as far as higher standards. And so we're considering all of the work that's done over 5 years, and that would include damage. So if they did like a 25% improvement as far as market value, and then like in the next 2 years were flooded, and we would have to add those two things together, and then they might hit that threshold. You can also adopt a lower threshold than 50%, maybe 30%. An improvement or damage could move that threshold if you choose to adopt higher standards. We're always encouraging people to adopt higher standards. And so the same thing here, this is just the same thing that I was talking about with improvement, but now it's repair costs and materials and labor. So it's 60%, and so they have to bring it into compliance. It's substantial damage, and then make sure that the lowest floor is elevated at least 1 foot above. And I will reiterate, it's damage from any cause, not just flooding. Whereas the ICC, the increased cost of compliance, is part of the flood insurance policy, so that only applies to flooding. The substantial damage is from any cause. And again, relevant publications, the desk reference, and then, as I said, the substantial damage estimator, SDE software. So I do have a class where I just kind of do the overview of this software. You know, we were thinking about making it an in-person class. It wasn't an in-person class, but there are classes, like FEMA has an online course that you can take on the software. So that is helpful. Yeah, the desk reference is good. So again, substantial improvement and damage are two sides of the same coin, but they are kind of the same thing. So there is a best practices thing that goes with it. There's like a publication that goes with the software. So you have best practices and a user manual. And there's also an installation guide. So these are helpful to have if you're going to use the software. I would definitely recommend it. It's pretty user friendly, I would say. So right now we're on version 3.0, and that's the link where you can go ahead and get it. So the software, it's downloadable. As I said, FEMA has an independent study course on it. So if you want to learn more about it, definitely take this course. I recommend it. And they have like sample data for you to work through different exercises with it. And so it's a more in-depth use type of class where you can get more familiar and hands-on experience with this software if you plan on using it. And then the software itself has like different areas where you can manually put in information that you get for market value and costs and stuff. It will also generate and calculate some of those numbers if you want to use that function. So just something else to be aware of. Part of post-disaster stuff, as I said, is figuring out where your special flood hazard area structures have been damaged. And so this is the Eureka tornado path in 2016. So they quickly put out this map where you have the path of the tornado and then where that intersects with the special flood hazard area. And they often coincide as far as tornadoes. And so you compare that path with the firm to determine where you're going to have to go and do these assessments and where people are going to need permits. And so in this case, the tornado has kind of a west to east type of layout, and then they have sort of a north-south layout of their special flood hazard area. And so they did this overlay, and then having a map like this can help you, especially as you're designating areas to different teams and making sure that nothing is missed, and you don't want to do any overlap either. And so it may also be obvious and in person where these damaged areas are, but Again, when do we do them? Anytime there's damage to structures that are in the special flood hazard area from any source. And so it's up to the local officials to determine whether the proposed work qualifies as substantial improvement, whether you are getting cost estimates from a licensed contractor, or however you're determining the cost of that. And having these requirements for substantial improvement in damage are part of the NFIP participation and the agreement with FEMA that you are adopting. And so our substantial damage stuff in our ordinance is really just tied into the improvement section. And so if you want to read that carefully, again, they are pretty much the same thing. And it can be difficult to get people to want to comply with flood requirements, like NFIP requirements, and raising their floor if they had suffered from a fire and not flooding. So people get way more concerned with flooding and are more compliant and pliable after a flooding event. That makes sense to them, but other disasters, they don't, tie into the NFIP requirements and bringing that into compliance. So that might be something that you deal with in the future. And then this is just a little bit more about organizing your post-disaster response and getting your ducks in a row for doing assessments. There's a lot that goes into it. You're notifying officials, you're working with these other community departments. As I said, some of them might be doing their own inspections for other stuff. You have to organize and train your inspection team. And I know there are smaller communities that might not have as many community officials, as much staff as larger communities, and that kind of resources. We are willing to help as much as we can. So you want to coordinate and follow up with your property owners. I mean, I recommend, as far as I know in my experience and training on disasters, it's really best to get the information to property owners as soon as you can. And so maybe going around and putting door hangers on the door handles of damaged structures. Steve used to talk about doing that, and it would have some of the FEMA publications on protecting their structures or elevating or whatever the case may be, and it had like a permit application inside of it, and maybe like sample out, or not samples, it would have like outreach or a letter in there that kind of talks about we're going to be doing inspections and you need permits to do repairs, and just doing whatever you can to let people know what's going on, because in a post-disaster environment, rumors can start spreading rapidly, inaccurate information, and so just trying to get ahead of that as much as you can. So after a disaster, you're identifying your limits, where all you're going to have to go and do the assessments. Again, that's where a map like the tornado path might come in handy. You want to have all of these addresses, the tax parcel map or property boundaries. Again, your initial screening, so doing your windshield inspection. And then that's when you would really understand what the scope of your inventory is. And then you're going to designate teams. Hopefully you have enough staff to assist you with doing the assessments. And then you would finalize these plans for data collection, and then having people enter that data into maybe your SDE software database, if that's what you're using, and just trying to make sure everyone's staying on track and having all of this information organized. So it is kind of a large undertaking, and that's why it's really important to be prepared before a disaster happens. Because having errors could potentially cost 2 or 3 days of work that you really can't afford to have this drag out. And so we want a hopefully streamlined process to do all of these inspections and get determinations and permits out there. So especially in a larger community, if there's a larger swath of area that's been damaged, it is a much bigger thing. And so before you do inspections, you should be working with and reaching out to these other departments such as police and emergency management. Definitely issue a press release as soon as you can, talking about inspections and your contact information and getting permits and when all of this is going to happen. again, having these other resources, your structure data, your floodplain boundaries, having your teams trained and ready to go. Hopefully being able to have the tax assessor on your side and talking about what kind of information you need from them and how much their office needs to prepare and assemble that data for you to have, if that's how you're getting your market value stuff. And so again, scheduling how many inspections can be completed per day, what is your target date for completing that field work, and then what is your target completion time for getting all of that processed and getting substantial damage determinations out there, because people again need that to make their ICC claims, and there's like a 60-day time limit on that. All of them have a deadline. The insurance policy has a deadline on making those claims, and so that needs to be met within enough time. And so your inspection lead, so this is all from the best practices publication that talks about having these inspection leads and what kind of teams you have, and you have like a software lead person that is organizing all of that data. And so they kind of outline this ideal process where you have all of these people working together. You have someone that understands the tool, you have someone that's kind of leading the inspections teams and coordinating them and their field materials and verifying their hours per day. Some communities have mutual aid agreements with other communities so that they can come in and help each other during times of disaster and help them with this. I think DRRA 12 is something that we got recent training on about how communities can be reimbursed for some of these expenses for doing disaster recovery. So that's something to look into. And like paying people to come help you. So yeah, then you'd be reviewing the data for correctness, finding solutions to any problems, you're keeping track of your team's progress. And then also there might be areas that require special permission for you to enter onto private property. And so contacting that person and getting into their damaged structures and the potential of damage there. And again, the concern for danger here is something to always keep in mind. So there is a lot that goes into this, especially with a larger disaster. It could be a small disaster where you only have to do like 5 structures, which is a lot easier. But and then, you know, as I said, making sure your inspection team is trained on what they need to look for, because it's going to be, you're going to have to look at the square footage, the structure type, the quality, verify the data with the inspection lead, making sure your 2-person teams are on the same page and giving you consistent data. So there's, yeah, you'd have to be taking photos and making sure that you're at the right property address and taking photos of the actual address on either the mailbox or the number on the structure. And so again, lots that goes into post-disaster stuff. We do have the post-disaster manual that kind of has, it explains the substantial damage rules, and it has sample handouts and outreach for residents. It has the field worksheets that they would be filling out as they do the assessments. A little bit of information on the SDE tool, sample press release, and then once all of your assessments are done, you have to send out the damage determination letter. And again, they need that to be able to make their ICC claim. And then information on mitigation programs. So there are specifically post-disaster grants that are available if you have a presidentially declared disaster. So that might be something that you would be interested in after that. And so this is something that's in there that we actually stole from Nebraska, but it's just kind of a flow chart on doing damage assessments, whether it's in the floodplain, is it up to the ordinance? If it's not, then you would have to bring it in. So it's just kind of a visualization of that process. And as I said, ICC claim for an insurance policy for flood insurance that's, you know, based on a flooding disaster, not any other type of damage. they're eligible for up to $30,000 to help them bring their structure into compliance. And so again, the floodplain administrator is responsible for getting that out to them. And so let me know if you don't have a copy of our disaster manual. I'm happy to send it to you. And of course, we're likely to schedule you for an audit about a year after your disaster, just to evaluate how it was handled and how permits were applied for and granted and all of that. Just and it's not to dock anyone for doing a bad job. We just want to help fix any issues that may have occurred. It's possible that FEMA might come out and work with your community. That does happen, but not as often as people might think. So, and here's an ICC project. So they made that claim on their flood insurance policy. And so they were working on getting it elevated. So here it is during that process. And then after completion, which actually think it looks pretty nice, and it's been elevated properly. You could see the flood openings going in on this side of it. And so it's been brought into compliance, and they use the ICC claim to help them do that. And there are other mitigation projects. So it could be relocated. I think it's Fred, right? See, relocation, elevation, demolition, something like that. So they have different mitigation options. And so if the structure is able to be moved, that's an option to relocate it. So this is a picture of this. This one wasn't an ICC project, but yeah, I have seen structures being driven down the road, which is strange to see, but if it can, withstand removal and then replacement to a place that has, less flood risk is an option. And this would tie into mitigation grants. Acquisition is another option where they buy out flood properties and then they demolish them, and then those areas are held in deed restriction where they're not going to be developed anymore, and they're just kind of held as open space, which is again eligible for CRS points. So yeah, that's the property acquisition projects. And so that's a big part of the HMGP grant, which is another post-disaster grant. So just something to consider there for post-disaster events. And then just a little bit more on violations, because again, this is kind of a common thing. And again, we do have classes just on violations. And so it could happen if they have constructed differently than their approved plan, or they had incorrect site information that goes back into doing inspections. And then again, people just not checking the elevation before or during construction can lead to issues. And so here's something we recommend is a letter of allegation. If a complaint comes to you or you see a potential violation, you can just send the property owner an allegation of a violation. So basically you're saying you might have a violation, and this is the problem, this is the solution, this is the citation from the ordinance where it says, this rule or whatever. And so this can sometimes help them fix a violation before you even have to go out and deal with them, or it can just be removed before you go out and do anything. And so if this doesn't work, then you would move on to a more threatening, I don't know if I would use that word, like a more stern violation notice after that. And then you would have to work on the enforcement process, but this can sometimes just clear it up before you even have to go that far. So that's why we have that in there. Be willing to make a mistake. If you make a mistake, just work through it. Don't try to avoid mistakes, or failure to address violation usually makes it worse. And so the faster you take care of things, the better. We have had issues where violations go on for a long time and then ownership changes, and then the new owner becomes responsible for fixing a violation that they didn't create. Of course, we don't have any disclosure laws in Kansas, so people often don't know that they're buying something that's in violation or even in the floodplain, which I think should change, but so far it hasn't. And so yeah, dealing with violations, it's difficult. And again, we are willing to be backup free if you just let us know about it. And then of course, CRS program. So the community rating system program, I don't know if I've actually gone over what that is, but basically it's a separate program. If you're in the NFIP, you can become part of this program. We would do an audit of your floodplain program first. And then once we close that, you'd be eligible to join for about 6 months. And so we would help you to design a program that gives you 500 points. And so a lot of that comes from adopting higher standards and maybe just having enough open space credit, and then that, and doing outreach projects. And so that's kind of the low hanging fruit. And we can usually get a community in at a class 9 for 500 points and a 5% discount on flood insurance pretty easily without adding a whole lot to your workload. And so we just recommend that you join at a class 9 for about a year. And if you like the program and you want to advance in it, then you can move up after that point. But it's a very beneficial program. We do anything we can to support the program. We offer some of the mapping that is worth credit, and we have other sample documents and examples from other communities of what you could do. And so it does provide a discount on flood insurance policies, and that is throughout the community and not just the special flood hazard area anymore. I think with risk rating 2.0, they changed that rule. So everyone gets the discount, and it helps to improve safety and communication in the community, which is another great benefit that I think should be emphasized more. And then FEMA presents your community with a plaque, and so it's kind of a good political will type of thing. So if you ever have any interest in that community, please let me know. We have a couple of communities that have pending applications, a couple that just got in, and a couple of communities that have just recently expressed some interest in joining that program. So very good program to be a part of. And then again, just a couple of wrap-up slides here, being prepared for flood emergencies, having, well, Steve would say have a kit in your office and then have a kit at home for dealing with disasters, but yeah, knowing where to go if evacuations are required. So hopefully really just having a working relationship with your emergency management department would be great to have. Again, turn around, don't drown. So this is a slogan from NOAA, and we actually did a Silver Jackets, which is like an interagency group. We did a project with them getting free signs out to communities. And so I hope we are able to do that again at some point in the future, to have these signs. And then Tara and I actually saw some of them posted when we went out to one of our communities. So that was cool to see, but these signs are great to have. I'm thinking you should be able to order them. And some of our communities have put them on those like portable road closure signs, and then it just kind of warns people not to drive into flooded roads. They could be washed out. It could be deeper than what they think it is. And again, that is a huge safety concern of people driving into floodwaters. And so just a good message to put out there. And then just another wrap up here, ASFPM, the Association of State Floodplain Managers, has this certification. And so we on the floodplain team have the certification. So it's just an online exam. Well, now it's online, or you could do online proctoring, an exam that just kind of tests your competence on floodplain management. And then that is also worth CRS points, and, just kind of make sure that you're, familiar with the NFIP and floodplain management. And then just a couple of other resources here. So Tara, my co-host, is the NFIP state coordinator. We're here to help with any floodplain management questions. Floodsmart.gov is a great resource. Of course, the Map Service Center, I talked about that yesterday. I should have added our floodplain viewer. But yeah, our website is a great resource for any floodplain management stuff in Kansas. And then a couple of things just to be aware of. The NFIP program expiration dates, so that ends in September. It's never been officially renewed since I've been here. It just keeps getting extended by Congress. As I said, the Endangered Species Act, hopefully we get new guidance on that soon. We are working on updating our state model ordinance, so hopefully we have that in the next couple of months. The new elevation certificate, so that's expired at the end of November. They should be releasing a new form at some point. As I said, the floodproofing certificate also getting an update. I think we're going to have flood safety week or flood safety awareness week in March again. So be on the lookout for that. And then we have brick applications. So that is ending on the 27th. And with that, we will launch our final poll question and we'll wrap it up. So, okay, what coverage can assist holders with compliance after hitting the substantial damage threshold? And this is part of the flood insurance policy. So give you another like 10 seconds on that. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and end polling and share the results. Okay, so yeah, that is the ICC increased cost of compliance. It's part of the standard flood insurance policy, which is what SFIP stands for, and it's part of the NFIP insurance policy. So ICC is the correct answer there. Other than that, I really appreciate you joining me this morning for the second part of this class. This is our contact information. If you have any questions, let us know anytime we're here. And again, if you would like a certificate for this class, please send me an email and I will get that out to you. Again, I don't just send them out automatically, but okay, stop sharing. Okay, I see your request for the DWR post-disaster manual, and I will make sure to get that out to you. Again, anyone who wants any of the resources I talked about today, let me know. Oh, and if you have any questions now, if you wanted to come off mute, that would be fine. Okay, well, hearing nothing, again, I'm available anytime through email or if you want to give me a call. Other than that, I hope you have a great rest of your day.